everyone to come in. Okay, cool. Looks like about half people that registered are here. So we'll kick off. So the reason for this webinar was that, I don't know if any of you saw this, and it's coincidental actually, because it was actually after we scheduled the webinar, but there was a study done just recently which analysed the transaction times across the 15 most developed economies around the world, UK being one. So you think of hotspots in Europe, the US, etc. And the UK came bottom in terms of the transaction time for a property. This was residential properties. So the average transaction time had increased to 189 days, which to me is absolutely fascinating and embarrassing at the same time. Like with the prevalence of technology, why are we going backwards rather than forwards in terms of transaction times? And I've got my own theories around it. I'll ask Julian in a second what his thoughts are. So Julian's from JMW. He's kindly volunteered to be part of this session. So the idea of this session really is to try and give you the weapons, if you like, that you need, the tools that you need to enable you to transact quicker. Like we all know that the quicker something completes, the quicker you get paid. So, you know, if we can speed up transaction times, that's good for everyone, and it's a better outcome for the borrower. So, Julian, thanks for joining. If you want to just introduce yourself quickly.
Yeah. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Julian Rogozinski. I'm a partner in the real estate department here at JMW Solicitors. Hopefully, be sharing some good insights with you today on how to speed up the legal process.
And Julian, just for context, like which kind of lenders do you work with?
So we work with a variety of lenders. We have sort of two arms to this. We have a quite sizable secured lending arm. So we act for the likes of LendInvest, Glenhawk, UTB, Kent Reliance, Precise. But we also work with some more specialist lenders as well. So SME development finance lenders who are relatively new to the industry, some smaller bridging outlets as well. So we have a sort of real variety of clientele in the lender sector. But on the flip side of that as well, we do a lot of work on the borrower side. So that's mainly what I do and what my department does. And it's essentially progressing refinances, development refinances, commercial, bridging and everything in between on behalf of the borrower. But I think having that secure lending department that we have and the depth that it has, you know, it leans really well into the type of work I do, because we understand lenders' requirements, you know, things that concern them, things they will take a view on, aspects they won't. And it gets us on the front foot and gives us a little bit of a head start really on the transactions that we work on.
Yeah, good stuff. So I think, working both sides is super important. All the lenders you've mentioned are on the platform, so definitely some common ground. If you've got questions along the way, please put them in the chat and we'll definitely look at them afterwards. So we're targeting about 30-35 minutes for presentation, and then we'll leave 5-10 minutes at the end for questions. So Julian, do you want to kick off with your slides?
Absolutely. Well, my first question is, are the slides showing on the screen?
Not yet.
Right. Give me 2 seconds. It works fine until the presentation starts, then it decides not to play ball. Right, so for some reason it's showing it's sharing on here, but if they're not coming up on there,
no, we haven't got them.
Right. Tell you what we'll do. We'll kick off anyway.
Okay. I've got them here. I've got them my side.
Oh, brilliant.
So I'll share them if they're coming up.
Do apologise for this technical glitch. It will be the last one.
Okay, is that coming up for everyone?
That's
Yes,
on mine.
it is,
Yes.
yeah.
Perfect. Okay, kick us off.
Super.
So insurance, I think, is very misunderstood. I certainly remember when I was back in my broking days, this was something that would come up last minute. Oh shit, we haven't got enough insurance, or we haven't got the right people named on the insurance. So give us a rundown on this.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, so, and again, this links into the main purpose of the webinar today. First and foremost, I just want to say that I know more than anyone that it's a common theme that the real estate finance industry, you know, deals are taking too long to complete. It always seems to be when the matters are in legals. You know, I've worked with developers, SME developers, portfolio investors for many years now, and it's one thing I will say, it's not in our interest for the transaction to drag out. We're normally on a fixed fee basis, so you know, the more time spent on a transaction, the less profitable that work is.
You're one of the few, though. For a lot of people, it is in their interest to drag it out.
Yes, yeah, and we've seen that in practice on the other side of deals as well, which is, you know, it's never what you want, really. So the purpose of today really is to share some of my top tips and hacks, as it were, to how to get these deals done to reduce the delays that are on transactions. And it just leans into what Ian just said earlier about the UK being probably one of the lowest ranked in terms of its turnaround times. And we'll explore that in a bit more detail later as to why that is. But hopefully what this webinar will do today is show you how we can reduce those timescales, what we can be doing, what the brokers can be doing, and the borrowers themselves. And to kick things off, the first thing I wanted to talk about was insurance. So what I would say at the outset is it's really important to make sure early on that we have adequate insurance in place on a refinance that meets the lender's requirements. Just using firstly buildings insurance as an example to this, the borrower will first need to make sure when they're looking at buildings insurance that the property is covered for not less than the full reinstatement value, and that value has to match what's in the lender's valuation report. So not what's in an independent report, not what's in, you know, a valuation that may have been done previously. The reinstatement value must meet what's set out in the lender's valuation, and we've seen it time and again that that's not been done, and it's just ended up delaying the matter. If the refinance that we're doing is of an apartment in a building or of a commercial unit in a building, the property is probably covered by a block insurance policy that will be in the name of the freeholder to the building. So this can get a little bit more tricky in this situation. Firstly, we need to get a copy of that policy as soon as we can to make sure that it stacks up and that the reinstatement value stacks up. Getting onto this sooner rather than later is quite important, because if the lender wants amendments to be made to that block policy and the freeholder isn't willing to agree them, then we can get ourselves a bit unstuck. So just attacking that early on, I would say, is quite important. Another point to mention about buildings insurance is pretty much every lender will want their interest noted on that policy. So it's really important to check the offer conditions at the outset for what their requirements are. Normally they will want maybe a general interest mortgagee clause, or they might want their interest noted as a named party. And just explaining basically the difference. If the lender wants to have their interest noted as a named party as opposed to just being a general mortgagee, they'll be able to enforce that policy as a named party. So it's normally something that they push for early on. The next point to mention as well, and this is really important when you're dealing with naming the lender as a party on the policy, it has to be the lender and the company, the vehicle that the lender is using that is named on the policy. And more often than not, because we act for so many lenders, we see that they'll have different vehicles set up for different types of refinances. So it's just making sure that we check the loan documents, make sure that we're naming the right party on the policy. Again, I've seen it time and again that not doing that is just, the lenders have just rejected it. Just moving on to another type of policy, which I think is quite relevant, and that's known as contractors all risk insurance. And these are relevant where development finance is being obtained. And just first and foremost, explaining what a car policy is, as we call it. It's essentially policy cover that will cover works being undertaken to the property. It would cover site materials of the contractors and also plant and machinery. And it also offers a form of public liability insurance as well. They look simple at first glance, you know, they're all risk, or they'll cover everything, but they're actually quite a complex policy with different variables. So I would say, again, at the outset, check the lender's requirements on what they want that car policy to show. And again, they would want to be more often than not to be named as a party on that policy. They will want the ability to enforce that policy directly, not just benefit from the losses, the proceeds that are paid out. So just getting onto that at the outset, so we can, the borrower can instruct the insurance broker, get that policy moving, so that it's, you know, we've got a head start on that really. And that's everything really on insurance.
Yeah, I think the point, the sort of, I guess what I wanted when we thought about this webinar was, you know, how as a broker, like getting the offer is the easy bit, right? It's navigating it from offer to completion.
Yeah.
And then it's really just signposting as much as possible for the borrower what they're going to need to provide, because I think a lot of it is left to chance.
Yeah.
No, and I think, you know, this is really useful information, because insurance invariably is organised by other people that you're perhaps not going to speak to as the broker, unless you deal with the insurance as well as part of your business. But there's probably somebody else involved. This information's got to go through, you know, numerous people, numerous channels, before it actually solidifies as the correct policy. So just, I think the really important points that Julian's making is that you know, the correct amount, simple things, but, you know, the reinstatement value on the actual valuation report, the name of the vehicle that the lender is using to lend through, these need to be on the policy, right? And these are probably not things that anybody thinks about until 2 days before completion. So, you know, that quite easily slows down your transaction time by 2 or 3 weeks if it's not thought about till last minute. So whole point of this is really, you know, day one, offer comes out, right, Mr. Customer, this is what you're going to need to provide. This is what you're expected to do. Let's get on with it. Here's a list. So one of the things we do want to do at the end, and Julian's promised to follow up on this, so I will hold him to it, is to provide a list of, or some materials that you'll be able to share with your borrowers, that will enable you to provide that document wish list to get you to completion faster.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, Ian. And you beat me to it actually, because I was going to say that the one thing I will be producing in the next day or two will be some comprehensive checklists that do exactly what you've just said, Ian. Is that, you know, once you've got your offer in, this is what we need to get from start to finish in as quick a time as we can. And, you know, we see it time and again really in terms of we see it time and again in terms of the you know, items missing that shouldn't be missed, or you know, insurance not being done right. So hopefully when we share these checklists, it'll be a really good guide for everybody that's listening, and you can utilise it with the borrower and just kickstart the process sooner rather than later. So you can definitely hold me to that.
Absolutely. Personal guarantees, again, last minute thing, I think this.
Absolutely, yeah. So the personal guarantees applicable whether it's a commercial refinance, residential, or a development refinance. If the borrower is a limited company, then I can almost guarantee, pardon the pun, that the lender will require a personal guarantee from at least one of the directors of that limited company. It's really surprising to see that we have borrowers, brokers, and even lawyers that don't appreciate the process of involvement, the process involved with the personal guarantee. And the main thing is the need to get independent legal advice, or ILA in the industry, for that personal guarantee. again,
Invariably, it needs to be a different firm as well. I know some firms will allow another partner within the firm to do it, but invariably it's a different firm. They normally want you there as well in person. So it's a time-consuming thing, right? You know, you might not be able to get an appointment for a few days. You might have to travel somewhere to do it. So again, this, for me, in my experience, this is something that always used to come up 2 days before completion. No one's thought about it, and it just throws another week, 2 weeks into the completion.
100%. Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head there, Ian. It's ILA will normally always be required by a separate firm of solicitors. You know, back in the day, probably pre-COVID, there was firms that were a lot of firms willing to do both sides. So they'd have a solicitor acting for the limited company and then somebody within the firm that would do the ILA. The majority of firms, including ourselves, we stay clear of that now just because of the risk of a conflict, and lenders also don't like it. So yeah, just I would assume always that it's going to have to be another firm of solicitors.
I think the other point to make here is that some lenders will not allow you to have it done until the documentation is finalised. So standardised, productised lender documentation in sort of the resi buy-to-let space, you know, there's not going to be any variance to it. You know, there's no negotiation. ILA can probably be taken pretty early on. But when you're talking about more commercial transactions where the the loan contract itself actually can vary, and there is some horse trading. You know, I can remember back to a transaction a few years ago where the client had taken ILA and they didn't or they hadn't quite yet finalized the contract, and they signed the contract or the loan contract after the ILA, and lender made them take the ILA again. So yes, try and get it as early as you can, but just be wary that in the situations where you've got you know, the contract hasn't been finalized, you know, the more commercial transactions, take it afterwards. We actually recently met a firm, I don't know if you've come across them, Julian, that are specialists in ILA. That's all they do. The founder's a lady called Anastasia. I'll share her details with everyone afterwards as well.
That'd be great. Yeah, and again, it's a really good point, Ian, because we've got to the point where the client's gone and got the ILA, so we think we're at the finish line, and then there's been a facility agreement amendment, or you know, the party names were wrong in the legal charge. Lenders will insist on a new PG or a new form of ILA being issued, even for instances such as that. So again, something to really bear in mind, and having an ILA provider on, you know, on tap is worth its weight in gold, I would say. Just one other point to make on this really quickly is more often than not, what the ILA provider will also have to do is sign a certificate, a very specific certificate that the lender wants them to sign to say that they've given the right advice and they've followed the correct procedure. Again, just making sure that when the borrower instructs the ILA provider that they get those documents and they make sure the provider signs them. It will just get rejected otherwise. So yeah, just being on top of those type of things, really. And that leads me nicely onto my next topic, which I just wanted to have a brief discussion of, and that's whether the property that's being refinanced is currently let out, and in most cases, unless it's a development site, it will be. So where the property is tenanted, whether it be on commercial leases or if it's a resi property on ASTs, the lender will want a full suite of the lettings documentation, or at least for their solicitors to have them and to sign off on them. So just using very quickly a residential property as an example here, items which will be on the checklist I'm going to be circulating as well, but key docs and items we would want to see early as is full copies of the ASTs, no missing pages, making sure the right parties, not an estate agent, for example, signed the ASTs, deposit protection certificates, inventories, building compliance documents, you know, an EPC with a sufficient energy rating of E or above. If it's an apartment in a building, then the lenders will want to see a fire risk assessment for the common areas. If the building's old, they'll want to see an asbestos report. So it's putting our mind to those things and thinking, okay, does the borrower have these? And if not, how quickly can they get them? If they can't get them, what will or won't the lender take a view on? And again, that's hopefully something we can help with the lenders that we work with and the knowledge that we have of their requirements.
I think a really good point to make here is that with a lot of this stuff, and they say the assumption is the mother of all f-ups. I imagine, most people on this call, you're decent brokers. A lot of this comes down to you'll assume that you're dealing with someone that you do this every day. So you just assume that everybody else is operating at your same level in terms of knowing these requirements and understanding what's needed. And Julian's probably the same. You just expect people to have tenancy agreements, right? You expect people, if they're more than 7 years, for them to be registered at land registry. But that is part of the problem sometimes, isn't it? Is that, we just assume that people have the same knowledge, or they're as professional, or whatever it is. And quite often that isn't the case. So even though it sounds like you're dumbing things down and perhaps telling people to suck eggs, for want of a better phrase, actually being very prescriptive with all of this information, I think is actually, it's a great value add to the service, right? Because how many if we talked about the list Julian's going to provide, how many other brokers will present that list on the day of offer and say, right, here's your offer, Mr. Customer, and here's a list of all the things that you're going to need to provide to get this application over, or get this completion over the line as quickly as possible. So for me, this is really definitely a differentiator for you to set your service above everybody else's.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think particularly for a lot of lawyers in the industry, there's an element of naivety in thinking that borrowers will know what they need to produce. And like you said, lawyers know, a lot of brokers know, particularly specialist brokers, but it's just it's hand feeding that information to the borrowers that's key. Early as. And just quickly on that, and on commercial leases, it goes a little bit further. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of points which we see get missed, but are actually quite relevant. So just thought it'd be useful to mention.
Sure.
So with the commercial property, with commercial occupational leases in place, again, we'd obviously want to see full copies of all the relevant documents. But what we need to check early doors is, firstly, whether the term of that lease is over 7 years. If it is, then that lease will be compulsory registrable at land registry. It wouldn't take legal effect unless it was registered. And it never ceases to amaze me how many times we get 10-year leases, 15-year leases that haven't been registered. The lender will want them to be on the title because it creates a complete title.
And we all know at the moment the issues with land registry, right? That's not something that's going to happen very quickly. Even if you expedite, it's still taking weeks. So, again, get this out there early. If you speak to, this is even a pre-offer point, isn't it? In your fact find, you're speaking to someone, I've got a 10-year lease, 8 years remaining. Okay, great. I assume that's registered at land registry, Mr. Customer. Oh, no, I didn't know I had to do that. Right, okay, let's get that done now. Before we get too far online, because there's nothing more frustrating, I think, as a broker, to be starting a transaction and expecting it, from a cash flow perspective, to mature at a certain period, and then obviously through no fault of your own, not happening because you've made the assumption that they know what you know. So again, I think same message. Let's just get these things out there super early. Build them into your process and make sure that people know what their requirements are.
100%. And I'll be putting more on the checklist as well with regards to that. That will help. Just small points like, has the lease been contracted out, for example, of the security of tenure provisions. Again, a key point, if it has been contracted out, the lender would want to see the stat deck from the tenant, which basically, a long story short, crystallizes that process. So it's just having those at the forefront of the mind, because they cause so many delays at the back end. It's crazy.
Which brings us nicely, land registry, onto what is a perennial problem. This is huge at the moment, right?
I would go as far to say, Ian, that this is probably one of the main causes of us being at the bottom of that list as a country, in terms of being able to get deals done within a suitable time. Our land registry service is for want of a better word, it's pretty terrible at the moment. Where this becomes really important is where the property's recently been acquired by the borrower, and we see quite a lot. You know, we have clients that buy properties at auction, or they want a quick buy and they'll get a bridge in place just to secure the purchase. That's great, but then they'll want to get out of that bridge as quick as they can, and they'll want to get onto a more sustainable term loan, normally within a 6-month period of acquiring the property. First thing to check in this instance is the buyer or the borrower registered as the proprietor of that property at land registry? I think at the moment there's currently a 12 to 18 month backlog on registrations, particularly new registrations, which is crazy. Ian correctly mentioned before, there is a process where you could have the registration expedited, and I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail on this because these points are quite relevant when considering this. So the land registry will consider an application to expedite a application to register someone's ownership at land registry, but in order for them to do so, first and foremost, they would only normally accept that application from the solicitors that acted on the initial purchase where the registration's going through. So if another firm has acted for the borrower needs to get onto them and get them to submit that application as soon as they can. Because that unfortunately, if we were acting on the refi, would be outside of our control. In order to consider an application for expedited registration, the lender would want some proof that it's needed. Typical examples that they'll consider is there an upcoming remortgage? So they'd want to see a copy of the mortgage offer. Is there an upcoming sale? They'd want to see the sales memorandum. As long as we can give them something, they would normally accept the request. But I will say
am I right in thinking that they are prioritising or will only really expedite matters if there's a monetary downside for?
What we're seeing is that they won't tell us this, but we see it in practice, that we think they're putting them at the top of the list. So they'll assess the consequences and the implications of not securing registration, because the problem you've got now is it's just created another step in the process. So you've got your standard registrations, which are bottom of the pile, not getting looked at for 12 to 18 months. But you've then got an absolute influx of expedited registration.
Everyone's expediting, so which ones are truly gonna actually impact people financially.
And I do believe it's only a matter of time before land registry sets some further guidance on this, that obviously go in their favour, that will set out what expedited applications they will look at before others and what the terms of those will be. I expect they'll be putting something in place for that pretty soon. But from our perspective, just as soon as we can get that process underway, the better. If they do accept it, it is normally a 10 working day turnaround before you hear from them. So you've still got a 2-week process. So again, just at the outset, if you get a feel for the borrower not being registered, just jump onto it straight away.
Yeah, okay. So I think what we're seeing is just triggers, aren't we? So with insurance, if it's development, certainly development, there's more insurances needed. So, get into that really early on. With land registry, it's a case of if somebody's been on a bridge and it's been, 6 to 9 months, less than maybe even 12 months, they've been on a bridge, think about that, when you're fact finding them, think about that could be something. So do you know if you're on the land registry? If you're not, contact your previous solicitor. Let's make sure that you are, get it expedited if you're not, because we're not going to be able to do anything until that's rectified. Similarly with the leases, even not even is it more than 7 years? Have you actually got a lease, Mr. Customer, right? I still speak to friends who in the space who are saying, people are still accepting or doing handshake deals with friends or people they think they know, and they're collecting cash. And I mean, it's just not going to work, is it? So, all these things should be red flags for us as brokers. make sure that these things are in place, and then obviously that's going to ensure that when we get to offering, we can move much quicker to completion. Okay, so multi-lets and HMOs.
Yeah, so this is one where this is a really important one in terms of its impact on refis. I use HMO as an example because we see it so often, it's so prevalent within HMO refinances, multi-let finances, that it's worth mentioning. So one key concern for lenders on types of refinances where you've got a multi-let property is whether the use of the property is actually lawful. The lender would want unequivocal assurances from the solicitor that the property is being lawfully used for the use that it currently is, and would lean heavily on the solicitors acting for that. And you can break this down into 3 key areas, which I'll go into a little bit more detail of. The first is, do they have valid licenses in place for the use? So again, using HMO as an example, that's quite an easy one. Is there a HMO license? Is it in the borrower's name? Because they're not transferable, so it has to be in the borrower's name. So getting that underway ASAP. If it's a commercial property, if it's a bar, do they have a liquor license that's valid? So things like that, just getting them in as soon as you can.
I think that's really a really useful point, because we make the distinction on the platform. We have in our sort of drop down of what type of property we have licensed HMO, because there's a huge number that don't meet that, right? So HMO there's an explosion of HMO, right? We all know that because of the shortage of housing, cost of housing, HMOs are becoming more popular. So I'm sure everyone on this call is getting more inquiries about that. So it's definitely, if you're not in the space, probably something to upskill on in terms of learning more about it, especially on the legal side, because I think there's, as we've already talked about, borrowers, not all borrowers, but some borrowers will come to the party perhaps not being as well equipped as they should be knowledge wise. So if you can be that oracle for them, where you're able to sort of set yourself apart from other people they speak to around Article 4, around the fact that licenses are not transferable, that they differ very much from borough to borough. So yeah, the upskill on this area, because I think this is a massive growth area.
Absolutely. And we're actually seeing brokers who we work with corner HMO markets for upskilling on their knowledge. And one particular piece of knowledge, actually, which I'm going to move on to now, which is really important for HMOs, and that's the planning position. So does the property have lawful use for planning legislation purposes? Now, if we're talking HMOs or a recent conversion from a residential house to a HMO, again, we're seeing a lot of those. On the face of it, there's a general misconception that when you're converting that type of property to a small HMO, that you don't need planning permission. And in first instance, that assumption would be correct, because under the General Development Order 2015, there's a permitted development to change from a C3 residential use to a HMO, small HMO C4 use. But there's one really big exception to this, and I've seen major deals that we've worked on fall out of bed, and I've also seen refinances fall away because of it. And that's where there's what's known as an Article 4 direction in place. Now, some of you may have heard of an Article 4, but for those that haven't, just to quickly explain what that means. So an Article 4 direction, if it's in place for a certain area, and our local search would pick this up, it would remove the permitted development rights for that type of change of use. So if there's an Article 4 direction in the area where you want to convert the property from a resi to a HMO, you'll no longer be able to do so without getting planning permission. Now, we get borrowers that come to us, or brokers that say, well, they've been using it as a HMO for years, surely
it doesn't matter.
There's a way around it. Exactly right. The only way we can get a lender comfortable in those circumstances is we'd need to see historic use as a HMO. So we'd want ASTs, again, full copies, correctly signed, and we'd want them to be immediately predating when the Article 4 direction came into place. And we then want an unbroken chain of ASTs right up to the current, the present date. which show that it, prior to the Article 4, this was always a HMO. Only in those circumstances can we get lenders comfortable, and 9 times out of 10 they'll want an indemnity policy as well, just to wrap that risk. So again, if you think that I've seen brokers really make HMOs work and they've overcome these issues, but it's putting your mind to those things and getting those items together that will get the lender more comfortable.
So Article 4 areas I'm aware of, parts of Wales, Devon and Cornwall, these are the places that are kind of getting inundated with HMOs, and it's very unfortunate, I think, for local residents being priced out of their own areas. So I completely understand why it's done, but as Julian rightly identifies, it will trip people up. And so, just be aware of it. Again, is something that you can make yourself or differentiate yourself to others by just being aware of that. Title covenants, Julian.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly cover this because it links into the other 2 points. So you've got firstly checking that the property is licensed, if it needs to be, planning position, and then thirdly is making sure that there's no user covenants on the title that could prevent the use that the borrower is currently using the property as. And again, we've seen this trip borrowers up, the final hurdle. There's the best example to use here is, there's an old covenant on the title that says that the property cannot be used other than a private residential dwelling or as a single family dwelling, there or thereabouts. There's a lot of case law on this, which I won't bore you with today, but safe to say that both solicitors and lenders will approach these types of covenants with caution. So if you've got a multi-let property, even if you've got a commercial ground floor with resi above, you can probably assume that those covenants will be breached, which the lender won't like. So how do we get around this? Well, firstly, we check the date of the covenant. The older it is, hopefully the less of a risk it will be. We'll then try to secure a suitable indemnity insurance policy to cover the risk. Now, this is really important. A lot of the underwriters that we're working with for indemnity insurance policies, they don't provide cover for future breaches. So if we've got a property that, say, again, a resi house, and they're saying, look, we're going to refinance this and then we're going to change it to commercial, or we're going to develop it and build an annex on and use it as a shop. They won't cover future breaches. They would, the use has to be existing at the time of the refinance. Only then will we have a good chance of getting a suitable policy in place. And then lastly, and this is really important, making sure that we get a clear confirmation from the borrower that they've not notified the beneficiary of the breach. They've not knocked on next door and gone, oh, by the way, using this as a shop, you don't any objections to it, do you? That will just kill any policy, and it will also kill any refinance prospects. So two other really quick things. Where you are getting an indemnity policy, it's harder to get them on leasehold properties, particularly where there's a freeholder that's still in existence that could potentially enforce the covenant. And secondly, it's harder to get them where we know it's the neighbouring property, so next door, that has the benefit of the covenant. And again, it all comes down to how likely it is that those covenants can be enforced, and trying to attack it early doors, really. So practically speaking, what we would do, we'd get a copy of the title day one, we'd look at the covenants, and we'd just try to build a picture of what risks there are that we need to overcome to get the lender comfortable. But it's just those things to think about where there's user covenants.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Julian. I've got a conclusion slide as well. I think the overall message is really, if you want to try and bring down these transaction times, firstly for me, try and work with a solicitor, try and get your customer, if they're not, in bed with someone, try and get them to work with somebody, because as a broker, if you can pick up the fact, like, part of the battle I used to find is actually getting the solicitor to even acknowledge you exist. So, quite often you'd call and you'd email and they just ignore you. So, by using somebody that you actually know, it completes the circle of trust, as it were, but it also just means that you're actually going to get someone that responds to your calls. So that's probably number one. Obviously, Julian's here. Sounds like these guys are really well equipped to deal both borrower side, lender side. Do you do dual rep as well, Julian?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, so it's really valid point to mention actually that I would always check on any refinance whether or not the solicitor acting, so if it was us, whether or not we can do dual representation, i.e. acting for lender and borrower. If we can, it's more seamless. You know, we're not dealing with a third party solicitors that have their own interests at heart. You know, it's cheaper. So any way we can do a dual rep refinance, we would always recommend it. But just a couple of things to think about with that. Firstly, acting on dual representation isn't always appropriate for certain types of refinances. So, for example, where it's a bridge or it's a high value development finance loan, both lender and normally lawyers would want it to be separate representation, just because there's a greater risk of a conflict of interest arising in those circumstances for those types of more complex refinances. So again, we'll explore that early doors, and we'll identify sooner rather than later whether or not we can do dual rep. Obviously, we'd like to if we can. Secondly, just making sure that whatever solicitors you do instruct, that they're actually on the panel for that lender. Again, dealing with the specialist lenders, if you're not on their panel of recommended solicitors, then they probably won't want you to act for them, and getting them to onboarded is quite a difficult thing to do. So yeah, they're just things to think about really on that front. And last but not least, you know, make sure your lawyers have the right expertise. I'm not doing the big sell here, honestly, but having lawyers and firms that are aware of, you know, how real estate finance works, how secured lenders work, what makes them tick, you know, what they'll accept, and being able to bring it all together really is a big step forward.
Yeah, I think that's a superb point, because you'll quite often speak to people perhaps that are newer to the sort of commercial property space. So what I'd call property entrepreneurs, start their journey. They might be tempted to use the conveyancer that did their main residence. You know, this is not someone that should be representing them in a development finance transaction or even a bridging transaction normally. You know, this is someone that's very much used to dealing with bog standard vanilla residential transactions and dealing with high street banks. The difference is massive. It's like a residential broker that works with Halifax and Santander trying to do what most of you guys on this call do, you know, trying to on this webinar, sorry, trying to do work with the likes of a specialist lender and advise people on bridging commercial development is just not something that somebody in that space would do. I think the same applies to the legal side. So, you know, that could be an opportunity for you to put your preferred solicitor in, not because there's necessarily anything in it for you, but it just makes the whole thing easier, right? You know, as we said before, if you can use somebody you know who's just going to pick up the phone to you and respond to you and give good service to your customer, then that's going to just make things infinitely easier. But I think my overall sort of take on this is, you know, look for the triggers when you're doing your fact find. Look for the triggers. You know, longer leases, at least being in place, the insurances. You know, look for the independent legal advice. You know, look for all these things. And where you know, build them into your fact find, build them into your process. Just double check. I'm sure you have, Mr. Customer, but have you got X, Y, Z? Have you, you know, if you're on a sub 12-month refinance, do you know if you're registered at land registry yet? No, okay, that's going to be a problem. Let's address that now, before we get too far into the weeds with a lender. So I think it's twofold, really. It's that initial fact find, look for the red flags, alert people to them, and try and deal with them then. And then it's really on the day of offer, present them with the offer. There you go, Mr. Customer. Congratulations, we've got you an offer. We're now ready to move to completion. And here's Julian's list of what you're going to need to provide now to get this over the line as quickly as possible. We're all incentivized to get this done ASAP. Tick this list off and we'll get it done.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with all of that, Ian. And I think, you know, the solicitors as well being proactive, you know, having a lawyer that is actually proactively getting these things done rather than being reactive. And that's where true value goes, I would say, you know, and I'll always say this, obviously, being a lawyer, but just educating the borrower a little bit as well on costs. You know, first thing borrowers look at is cost, which is the cheapest. You can't operate like that with specialist finance, because it's these types of things that we've been through on this call today, that if your lawyer's on it and he's working with, or she's working with the broker to get these things and resolve these issues, it's worth its weight in gold. It genuinely is.
Yeah, no, but buy cheap, pay twice, or whatever it is.
Yeah,
I think
twice. As I learned with some joiners that I employed recently.
What's that, sorry?
As I learned with some joiners that I employed recently.
Oh, right, at home, yeah. I think the other question, I think, yeah, is so true. I think the other thing as well, as a broker, you know, you know in your head which lenders are good and which lenders are bad, and you'll go through that process with the customer where you say, right, okay, look, we've got 3 lenders here. Number one's the cheapest, but in 8 weeks' time, you're going to hate me because they are painful and it's going to be an awful process, and we're going to fall out. So let's not do that one. Number 3 is, you know, notorious for changing goalposts at the last minute. Number 2, they're not the cheapest, but I have a great relationship with them and they're going to move super fast. Like, similar thing here, right? You know, if people are trying to use a lawyer, have a look that you don't know or haven't come across, have a look at them. Do you think they meet your sniff test of whether they can actually do it, right? Pick up the phone to them, ask them, you know, have they worked, especially when it comes to development. I've seen this quite a lot on development finance or any element of development. It can just be heavy refurb. You know, if they're not used to working with construction documentation, it will be like pulling teeth. So, you know, just get a decent firm that you know, that you trust, if you don't already, that can cover the whole remit. Someone like Julian at JMW, that, you know, if you have the opportunity to put them in, it's just going to make your life easier and make deals quicker. Questions? We've got one from John Haynes. Are there any others? Does anyone else want to put one in the chat, and then we'll start to wrap up? So John Haynes' question: what do other countries do regarding registration of property? Surely Land Registry must have an action plan to get up to date after 4 years after COVID. I couldn't agree more. What do they do?
Do you know what? Guess is as good as mine on that, John. And I know that's not a helpful answer. I mean, there's probably some discussion on this in MIPIM this year at the International Property Festival in France. And I think, you know, I've got to just say, from you know, my assumption, it can only be down to resource and investment. You know, I don't think there's enough investment or resource at the Land Registry. You know, and I don't want to discredit them too much, because there are some really talented people at the Land Registry, you know, technical people that don't want to be difficult and that assess risk and actually can help. You know, if we register, if something's about to be registered incorrectly, them giving you the heads up that, look, we're going to do this, are you sure this is what you want? That's helpful, but the problem is the few and far between, you know, and there's no incentive and there's no accountability. You know, who do you complain to when the registration isn't coming back in time? Where's the accountability? So until those things are put in place, that there's like an independent body that can govern, you know, when things aren't going to plan, until there's investment and until there's real resource at all different tiers at the Land Registry, I think it will just continue to get worse. The government really needs to have a good think about it. Sounds like
pretty much anything else in this country, no investment, no technology.
Yeah. 100%. And local councils are the same, and that's why the planning process is on its knees. You know, I'm working on developments at the minute that should have had planning sign off more than 12 months ago, and there's absolutely no reason other than the fact that the the local planning authority have said, look, I've got a stack of papers this high, I'm just spending half an hour a day working through the ones at the top of the list. That's the accountability. You know, how does that work when we're trying to drive the property market and build more houses? It needs a lot of work.
Going back to where we started, other than Land Registry, you know, what are the reasons it's taking so long? I mean, I think working from home is a real problem. You've got lawyers, you've got surveyors, you know, even people at lenders. You know, I was with somebody yesterday and he moans about this a lot. You know, they're putting the washing on, they're walking the dog, they're doing anything but working, basically. Is it as simple as that?
I think that's a part of it. Yeah, you know, it's the very sort of 9-5 mentality.
It's
there.
definitely a post-COVID thing, isn't it? Really?
Oh yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
again, I keep harking back to local authorities because they're the same. You know, it's. I'm not saying, look, I'm not. This is not me brandishing all local authorities or anything like that. But what we tend to see is that you know it can be really hard to get hold of the right people and you know, to actually speak to somebody.
Well, it's the same with everything through the transaction, right? Planning's the same. You know, the planning officer at 5 o'clock, the 2 days a week they're in the office, their chair's spinning. You know, they're out the office, they're doing anything other than working. But there you go, broken Britain, all of that. Let's not get political. Another question, Abalash. Go on, Julian. Sorry.
I was just really going to touch on one last point as well. I think also it's risk parameters changing as well. There's a lot more being a lot more interest being registered now. Obviously, more houses being built, but more ways of doing different types of quirky refinances, splitting titles, creating leases, carving away parcels. You know, because there's a lot more going on. I think, to give them a little, bit more credit, the land registry have got quite a lot more to do. But then that goes down to the resource point, doesn't it? If there's more registrations process.
The point is, when you look at property transactions over the last few years, we're at a trough, aren't we? We're not at a peak. You know, go back over the last sort of 10, 15 years, transaction volumes at the moment are low by historical standards. So, you know, it kind of makes you wonder. I mean, there's two things I think here. I think firstly, as confidence returns to the market, things will speed up, because I think a lot of what happens at the moment, certainly legal side and underwrite side, lender side, you have that second guessing, people spending more time on files and just, you know, not that they're slapdash when things are busier, but when the market is racing ahead, there's less chance of something going wrong. So there's less consequence of being wrong. And so I do think that as confidence returns to the market, base rate continues to drop. If, you know, Labour government can translate any of their rhetoric into policy, that's challenging, I know, then obviously the market will continue to improve. And I do think you will see an improvement in timescales. But I mean, it does make you wonder, if we're at, you know, 2/3 of where we normally are in terms of transaction volumes, and the land registry is creaking, almost dying, you know, what happens if we do? And it almost is that actually what stopped, part of the reason that's stopping the market kicking on is the fact that no one can actually do their transactions in any kind of time frame. We've got another question I've just seen, sorry, Julian, from Abalash. What can be done in the event an offer is obtained on a personal name and the buyer changes his mind to purchase under a limited company? So for me, probably better fact finding in the first instance. You know, have the conversation with them. You know, why are you buying in a personal name? If it's an investment property, have you taken the correct tax advice? You know, because switching to a limited company is generally going to be for one of two reasons. Either if it's a buy to let, the rental cover is better, limited company. So therefore, explain that to them. That they can potentially get a bigger loan, and if that's attractive, that might be a reason to switch. But I guess the big reason is obviously the tax benefits. So have they spoken to an accountant? So for me, I would say that event probably doesn't happen if you've had better conversations with them at the outset. If you do get to the point of where you've done all of that, but they still try and switch after you've got the offer, then you need to go back to the lender, and it will normally be a new application. So either it's a different lender, new application, or the same lender if they do limited companies, but it is a brand new application because effectively it's a different borrowing entity. Anything to add, Julian?
Yeah, just one of the points on that, because we see this quite a lot in the context of title splits, which basically means, let's say we're refinancing a multi-let building, residential apartments, top floor, commercial ground floor. The borrower is raising finance on it. Now, on that type of building, the lender would normally want the titles to be split. In other words, for those leases to have their own, for those apartments to have their own leases, and for the commercial ground floor to be carved out with its own lease as well. So, without going into too much detail, because it's really technical, you can't grant a lease to yourself. So this is where we normally have clients that instruct us and go, well, I've set up a limited company, so I want the limited company to be the leaseholders of those leases. Legally, that can be done, but important things to think about are, firstly, what Ian says, getting the right tax advice, because the lender will want those transactions, and they are transactions, to take place at full market value to avoid a transaction at an undervalue risk. Secondly, has the lender, you know, approved the borrower, the main borrower being the limited company? You know, have we got new offers with those details on it? And thirdly, you know, making sure that we structure it in a way within the department that, you know, we've got one side which is say my department that will prepare the leases, get everything ready, and then we need to have another solicitor within the department that can then act on the borrowing lender side, making sure the lender's comfortable with that at the beginning, because if not, then we'll get another solicitor involved. You know, we're having to get somebody to act for the borrower and somebody act for the seller in that situation, and it's not really a route you want to go down because it can get really costly and time consuming. So just checking those things really early doors, but I tend to see a lot of that in that scenario where we're splitting a title as part of a refinance, which we do quite a lot of.
So final question, and I think the answer is yes. Julian, do you have a guide of information required to be provided by a property developer for a refurb or new build, resource guide or Word template, checklist, etc.? It's almost like it's a plant, isn't it? It's like a plant in the audience. Yes.
Yeah,
and I will
brilliant.
be providing that in the next
couple of days.
Monday, Julian?
Yeah, I'm aiming for Monday, but I want my marketing team. I know this is me semi-making excuses. We've got some nice branding. I don't want to send you a bog standard Word document. Well, you know, want them to look nice.
We'll leave it at this because we're coming up to the hour. So we'll leave it at this, Annie, and for everyone else. At some point next week, there will be a nice document that comes to you that will give you all of these things in a checklist so that you can then share that with your borrowers.
100%, yeah, definitely. And also, just as a final point, I'm happy for the slides to be shared as well after this. So no issue at all with that. And we will be getting those checklists out next week.
And we'll share Julian's contact details as well.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
All right, guys, thank you very much. Hope you found it informative, and we will see you next time. If you've got any suggestions of content you want to be covered, reach out to either myself or anyone else in the team. Hit the help desk at brickflow.com or info@brickflow.com, or speak to your account manager, whether that be Anna or Tessa, and we will look to put together a webinar that covers that topic for you. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, guys. Thanks very much. Take care.